Baka. Welcome.
Thank you, Avi. I bring greetings from Canada very, very early in the morning here. So I've spent many years in the women entrepreneur space, particularly with women in international trade. One of the founders of the first Canadian chapter of the Organization of Women in International Trade. But I'm here today in my role as the regional representative for the Trade Facilitation Office Canada. And TFO Canada's mandate is to confront the challenge of global poverty. And how do we do this? Well, by helping exporters in Africa, Asia, and Latin America access the Canadian markets through sharing our trade expertise and connecting SMEs with Canadian buyers. I call it Canada's best kept secret. SMEs can tap into valuable and free information about the Canadian market through our website. Everything from market trends and regulatory info to answers to questions like, how do I find Canadian buyers? To accessing over 20 sector-specific market information papers with great detail about the Canadian market, and on topics like everything from coffee, apparel, food, and many, many more. So SMEs can register to be part of our exporter database that Canadian buyers and importers search when they're looking for new sources of supply. And remember, this is all free because we're funded by the Canadian government. So you can just go to www.tfocanada.ca to register as an exporter. We also work with trade support institutions in market to help them provide export readiness training to SMEs. And we have a particular focus on capacity building of women-led SMEs through specific projects in Africa, which will be of particular interest to this audience.
So if I can please start with Susan, if you could change one thing in the trade sector or in the trade agenda of Africa, what would that be? Susan, considering that you're starting the furthest away from Africa, what would that be?
Okay, well, first of all, in terms of trade, I mean, women in Africa are usually the backbones of the economy as SMEs and micro enterprises. So I think there's a need to focus on trade policies that impede women's progress. And, one of the things I hear a lot is that what needs to be done is to address the issues to help informal traders. The acute challenges that come from cross-border trade, often from border issues such as sexual discrimination and harassment, gender bias, extortion, even ethnic-based discrimination. I mean, even limited gender considerations in sanitation facilities at the borders. I mean, women come with babies. I mean, there's the whole issue of food security. If there's delays and they're crossing borders, and so the food could be off then. And then this can lead to food waste, which ties into climate change. So I think that there's a real need to educate and train border officials on gender sensitivity, since women often lack the knowledge, and they also need protection when they're crossing the borders. So this kind of like gender sensitivity training, like downstream at the border and even upstream for policy officials. I mean, I think that when you're easing all of the trading, within Africa, and then it opens up the doors to the world. The product standards are upgraded, and women are then better able to tap into the global market.
Susan, I want to use that as a segue, because you've been working on TFO Canada's projects for women in Africa to support capacity building for exporting. So what Casper is saying is that, only 25% currently from a fair trade perspective is actually actively engaged and is working through it. So, for example, how has your projects, in terms of that support and capacity building for exporting, how has it allowed women to scale and grow their businesses? And what else has been the impact that you can tell us about in terms of some of these projects that you are busy with?
Okay, well, first I'll just give you some quick background about the two current projects that are operating in Africa. The first is Women in Trade for Inclusive and Sustainable Growth. It's a 5-year, multi-million-dollar project that focuses on sectors with high demand in Canada and with high employment potential for women. So that would be fresh fruits and vegetables, processed foods, home decor, footwear, cosmetics, and services. So TFO Canada works in partnership with trade support institutions in 24 countries, including 14 in Africa. And it aims to increase the representation of women in the leadership of these institutions, to strongly incorporate gender equality into their policies and programs, and then to increase the exports of women led firms through capacity building approach and doing things like bringing them on trade missions and market familiarization tours. So by the time the project wraps up in 2024, we will have trained about 15 trade support institutions in Africa, and over 3,000 women-led SMEs will benefit from the training to grow their businesses through exporting and, from increased sales. So as far as, all of the results, I mean, also there will be more women-led SMEs as members, clients, and leaders of trade support institutions. There will be more gender responsive institutions providing appropriate services to women-led exporters. With more, as I mentioned, more women participating in trade missions and establishing commercial relationships with Canadian buyers. And in that whole project, about 15 million in export sales will be generated, and there will be a more balanced share between women-led and men-led exporters. The second project is called Making Trade Work for Women in Sub-Saharan Africa, Lesotho, Uganda, Madagascar, and Ethiopia, to enhance the economic empowerment for women entrepreneurs. And specifically, it aims to help women-led exporters in the specialty, apparel, textile, fashion accessories, and home decor sectors to increase their exports to new markets. It is also enhancing the abilities of trade support institutions to support more women-led exporters with services.
Susan, Casper had a question for you on the group, and I want you to pick it up with my next question. But he wanted to know which part of Africa is your organization more present? And at the same time, or kind of as you answer that question, I want to understand how we can establish a more strategically beneficial partnership in terms of Africa and Canada, and whether specifically for women or whether in general, how do we now start to drive that Africa-Canada trade partnership in a more heightened way, if we can?
Okay, so as far as our projects in Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and then our Women in Trade project, the WIT project, the first one I called the Loom, the Lesotho, Uganda, Madagascar, and Ethiopia. But the WIT project, there's actually 14 beneficiary countries in Africa. And maybe what I will do is, after I finish answering this question, I can put those in the chat. And in terms of how do we establish more strategically beneficial partnerships? Well, I think such an important piece of that is encouraging collaborations. And I'm just going to tell you that in the last month in Canada, there were quite a number of summits with different countries in Africa. For example, I participated in ones with delegations from Ethiopia and Nigeria. And the Canada Africa Business Chamber was quite involved in these as well. And there's so much relationship building that goes on when these kinds of things happen, where people get to know each other, and it really then begins to enhance, two-way trade and investment. So I think that the more of these kinds of collaborations that can happen, the better. And we want to ensure that more Canadian companies can go into Africa, and we want to provide, we need to provide the same benefits for African companies to access the Canadian market. So in all ways that Canada can support the enabling environment in Africa, for example, through the work, export readiness training that TFO Canada does. Another piece I think that can establish a more strategically beneficial partnership is facilitating the startup of the Organization of Women in Trade, OWIT chapters in Africa. There's a number that exist there already, and it's just been amazing how strong that they've become, and how interested other African countries are in establishing, these kinds of chapters, which then, they go on and they do not only training, but they do advocacy work. And the last piece that I'll talk about is that Canada has an emerging African strategy to increase trade and investment between, Canada and the many African countries. We're an aging country. Our population is aging, whereas Africa has a youth bulge. So, the Canadian government really wants tangible actions in this strategy to move the dial in strengthening trade and investment. Africa is not always on the radar for business and investment by Canadians. So, but now, because of this emerging strategy, and we just see more people talking about this now, and bringing consultation and engagement from different areas. And this whole strategy has to be mutually beneficial.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's exactly it, is that it must be truly Africa-Canada partnership, so that it's not aid for Africa, it's how do we meet each other halfway with our relevant resources. So we've got a youth bulge, you've got an aging nation. How do we meet each other halfway? You've got Canadian dollars, we have land for investment, for example. So how do we meet each other halfway, so that Africa is not always about receiving aid. Africa is also about how do we enter the trade agreement as partners, in terms of what we have as resources. Casper, has that answered your question? Susan, 60 seconds. What is your burning issue?
Okay, I would say I think contacts are such a key to success in international trade. Women are natural networkers, and so any way that we can bring women together, across countries, across continents, to do this kind of networking, I think that's really when the magic happens. And I think the last thing I would like to say is that phrase that I think is so wonderful, which is an ounce of trade is worth a pound of aid.
I'm going to steal that.
Well, it's not mine. I've stolen it, so I allow you to steal it too.
I love that. Say that again. An ounce of aid. An ounce of
trade is worth a pound of aid.
I'm gonna take that. I'm owning that. Thank you, Susan. Thank you.